So welcome to the 8th edition of the Wage Roundtable series. The title today is Blue Economy in the Arctic, Legacies, Changes, and Coastal Communities Survival. It was organized by Anna Karlsdottir with the support of Karen Everett and Gail Vandal. We are very pleased to have the opportunity to have these discussions with you all. Thank you for being here. Karen Everett will be our facilitator today, so I'll pass the floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Karen Everett, and I'm a researcher with the Cher Hamela at University of Laval, and I'm a member of the Wage Circumpolar Partnership. So it's my pleasure to facilitate the roundtable today. And we'll just start with some brief introductions. So we have Anna Karlsdottir, who, if you don't know, is an associate professor in human geography and tourism studies at University of Iceland. She's conducted Arctic social science research since 1996. Her work spans regional development, coastal community transition, blue economy and gender, cruise tourism, and climate resilience in Arctic communities. Anna is also a former senior research fellow at Nordregio, and she was the administrator of the Nordic Arctic Cooperation Program and mobilized various research projects bridging science and policy on Arctic socioeconomic transitions and leading different Nordic working groups on sustainable regional development in the Arctic and Nordic rural regional development committees. We also have with us David Holan, who's a lifelong Alaskan and anthropologist. He's also a wage member and the Training Commission chair. As the Alaska Sea Grant Coastal Community Resilience Specialist, he's dedicated to providing expertise, research, and extension services that enhance the culture and well-being of coastal communities across Alaska. David also works in rural communities from the Arctic to the Southeast Alaska, providing data and decision support tools for communities to make informed decisions about adapting to future climate and environmental scenarios. Also joining us is Claudio Aporta, who's a professor and Canada chair at the World Maritime University, and his research is at the crossroads between marine management, anthropology, and geography. Claudio has done ethnographic research in the Canadian Arctic since 1998, and he has documented Inuit knowledge and use of marine and coastal areas in all regions of the Canadian Arctic. His research has also focused on the geographic representation of Indigenous and environmental knowledge, and some of his research outcomes include the co-creation of digital atlases. And we also have Rike Jacobsen, who's an associate professor at the Center for Blue Governance at Aalborg University. Rike is a marine social scientist and anthropologist working on cross-disciplinary marine and coastal governance research projects. Her primary research interests are the governance and societal adaptation to change in the Arctic and in Greenland in particular, the politics of sustainability in marine governance, empowerment and inclusion of coastal communities in transition processes, bridging the gaps between scientific and local ecological knowledge, and climate and biodiversity change impacts and adaptation in fisheries. So welcome, everybody. I think this will be a very interesting discussion. And we'll start with the first question. Can you talk briefly about your research and/or practice and explain how issues of blue economy and its impacts on coastal communities manifest in your work? And for the first question, we'll start with David.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. I'm part of the Wage Partnership, and it's also great to see so many of our students here. I chair the Training Commission, and we've done a number of field schools, and it's great to see the students join us this morning. So I work for Alaska Sea Grant, which is a partnership between NOAA and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And so my role is to help bring a lot of the resources, data, tools, things like that from NOAA and the University of Alaska Fairbanks to coastal communities. So I do extension work. I also do research. And so I'm working on several research projects that deal with resilience, climate migration, both across the United States as well as internationally and in Alaska. And so when I work in coastal communities, as an anthropologist, thinking about the blue economy, historically, I also teach anthropology, and I teach an Alaska Native Studies class at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And, I always remind my students that the coastal communities of Alaska have always been marine peoples. They've always been embedded in the blue economy. And so, historically, most of the food that came into communities was in the form of marine mammals, fish, seaweed, shellfish, and the Alutiiq of Lower Cook Inlet have a saying that when the tide goes out, the table is set. I always, consider that when thinking through these issues of the blue economy. And, my job is to help build resilience in communities. I do it through, the community in Alaska, the climate is changing at 4 times the global rate. It's warming faster than anywhere on the planet. This also is causing issues with ocean acidification, harmful algal blooms. I work with a lot of tribal communities that are also doing their own monitoring, especially in the nearshore environments. NOAA takes care of the deep water, the blue area. But in the nearshore, a lot of the work that is being done by tribes. And that has to do with monitoring resources that are important for their way of life. And so one of the things that I consider is that when I talk with communities, children are especially important, and people want their kids to stay where they are. And so we have to think through the process of how can we create resilience and adaptation plans and things that we can think about doing in terms of, building better community well-being for generations down the road. And not thinking about adapting to the world as it is today, and it's changing today, but thinking about adapting to the world of tomorrow. And so I think I'll just leave it at that, and we can come back to some of these questions, and I'd like to hear from others. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Claudio?
Yes, hi everybody. Nice to be invited to this roundtable. I'm based in Sweden right now at the World Maritime University, which is sort of a capacity building United Nations university for the International Maritime Organization, for IMO. So my research has not been really connected to the blue economy per se, but I think my trajectory sort of put me into this space because I, as an ethnographer, I did research mostly in Igloolik many years ago. I started there, and then I follow in other communities, but my focus was on documenting Inuit geographic and environmental knowledge. So that included mapping and documenting and understanding place names, sea ice use, Inuit traditional trails, sort of mapping this mobility network in the Canadian Arctic that, of course, included both land and ocean. So that was one kind of interesting element of that journey, was to see how the ocean space is actually home for Inuit, including the sea ice. So there is a little bit what Davin was saying as well, that that perception of the ocean as an isolated entity is not necessarily part of the Inuit ontological approach, but in transitioning from sort of more classic anthropology to marine affairs at Dalhousie University, and now to a maritime university where shipping is the main maritime issues are basically all over. Of course, the connection can be made where the space that is home for Inuit, then it becomes also, of course, a space for transit of ships. And I mean, that, of course, with climate change, the shipping has increased 37% just from 2013 to 2024. And this involves, all the activities that we could think of as the blue economy. So fishing, of course, and tourism, cruising, resource extraction with, for instance, the Murray River project mine in northern Baffin Island, and then, of course, community supply. So there is this transition of this ocean space in the Canadian Arctic that is certainly bringing more activity, is bringing stakeholders that are from outside of the Arctic, and those events are creating new opportunities for people, but also a lot of potential conflicts in terms of impacts. Of course, there are economic and social and cultural and environmental impacts of the increase of transit, ship transit through the corridors or through the Canadian waters. So there is, for instance, if there is an oil spill, that because of the remoteness of the Arctic, that creates a lot of problems. So it's a really sort of complex time right now, I think, for Inuit communities. And there is, of course, the idea of blue economy, and alongside there's the idea of blue equity, of who actually benefits from economic development, out of the ocean resources. So, of course, at the end of the day, the idea is that blue economy needs to be sustainable. So striking the balance between use and conservation, but it's not at all a simple matter. And then you come to the point where you realize that proper engagement of indigenous communities and organizations, Inuit mostly in the Canadian Arctic, is absolutely essential. So I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. Rike, we'll go to you.
Hello, bonjour, everyone. Thank you for the invitation today. If I should say something about my research focus, I started 15 years ago as a PhD student. By very fortunate chance, I got the opportunity to study climate change in Greenland. And as it often is, like how exactly does climate change impact a society? And in Greenland, there's a strong tendency to maybe look at the fisheries, because there's a very direct human-environment interaction that's really important. And I've been actually looking at the fisheries ever since. I think if you talk about blue economy, it's really obvious in Greenland how it has a strong blue economy in its fisheries, which is governed by the Greenlandic self-government. And so the Greenlandic fisheries is responsible for 95% of the import of goods in Greenland. So it really sustains the main economy there. And then at the same time, you of course have these more type of activities that's been important for such a long time in terms of marine mammal hunting, but also like fisheries like for capelin or Arctic char. And at the same time, when these commercial fisheries have really developed up through the 20th century, they also became important for households and self-sufficiency. So it could also be cod, Greenland halibut, and so. And then as a researcher, as an anthropologist, my interest I learned from the supervisor when I started working at Center for Blue Governance. He said the fishery is really often in coastal communities like a window into society. And there are so many different phenomena you can look at through fisheries. And so, for example, I've been looking a lot at the fishery law in Greenland, which has been attempted, attempted to make a new fishery law for 15 years, and now they're actually just this year, perhaps managing. But the thing is, it was very difficult to get political consensus about reforming a fishery law, because it has so many different masters, I would say, in Greenlandic society, because the fishery is so old. So there's so many like established interests around it and different groups. So you both have a fishery that should really serve coastal communities in terms of like having, for example, a local factory, which is like sometimes the only main activity next to social services. And on the other hand, you also have like these really state-of-the-art offshore trawlers that has a really nice profitability and bring in a lot of taxes and income to society. And then you have that whole subsistence or self-sufficiency household economy next to it. So it's also a very mixed blue economy they have there. So that's a remaining interest for me. And then in addition, because there are so many different things that touch on this fishery. So for example, recently I've also been working on a project that has worked on how to include local and indigenous knowledge of biodiversity changes and how fisheries have responded to such changes. And that's also, things are really happening quickly. I can only echo that. Yeah, I think I should stop now and let the next speaker speak, but thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. And Anna, you're up.
Thank you. And I think I will, as Rege, maybe start with how I came into research on something fishery related. I'm from Iceland, and I have a background from fishery family up in the north. So I was only 14 years old when I started working in a fishery plant. And so maybe I have some of this kind of rhythm of a small fishery community in my veins. I don't know. At least I was very interested already as young scholar in understanding all these processes at play that were kind of confusing in the late 90s. And my PhD actually intended to understand processes of globalization and vertical integration of fishery industry plants on both sides of the Atlantic. But during the process, I kind of lost interest in the business perspective or element in this, and started becoming more and more interested in the transition on the community scale. How was this affecting families? How was this affecting women and women's roles in coastal communities and children? So that became my focus, really. And now, well, coming from Iceland, I've also seen some big seeded changes in the role of fishery communities around, where we have the effect of a fishery governance system that has meant consolidation and of companies involved, consolidation of license holders or quota holders, that and it kind of also impacts the power positions within Icelandic society. So it's an interesting dynamic that has evolved, I think, and I find it to some extent quite problematic from a societal perspective. But that said, being interested in gender and gender equality, I have engaged in a couple of projects that were about the role of women in the Arctic and in the Nordic region. And my most recent engagement was on gender equality in the Nordic blue economy, where we worked on understanding better the role of women across different strata in the fisheries economy and the aquaculture economy. And then we were kind of also in the time where blue economy as a concept had kind of almost replaced this notion of fishery economy. So we applied that. That said, I think, there's a lot of promise that this blue economy holds, and it holds this diversification of, it's a spin-off economy from the fisheries economy, if you will. And in the way it manifests in Iceland is that some of the activities that are closely connected to the fisheries economy now involve more biochemistry, biotechnology, enzyme industry, circular industry related to using waste from the fisheries industry. And this has in many people's mind changed the concept of what this holds. and it has actually engaged much more, more varied professionals in the field. And so I think this has both some very promising prospects, but I think also it has some problematic prospects in that this also entails the belief that, for instance, carbon sequestration into the ocean is something that will save our world, which I'm rather skeptical about. Yeah, let's just keep it that.
Great, thank you. And thank you to everyone for sharing more about your research and how you got into the field and what you're doing. So thinking about all of this, which type of changes have you noticed when it comes to reconceptualizing fisheries and other resource extractions from the sea, lakes, and streams from where you've done your research? So this time we'll start with Claudio.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I struggle a little bit with this question in terms of sort of the reconceptualization that might be happening. I think that, you know, at least in Canada, there is some level, I think, of rethinking these issues, potentially with more engagement from Indigenous communities, sort of in the context of reconciliation. And I mean, there are some interesting examples, like the National Marine Conservation Area, Taduru-Tiup-Imanga, in north of Baffin Island. There is the Northern Low Impact Shipping Corridors that has been developed as we speak, with the engagement also of Inuit communities and Inuit organizations. But then there's also the concept of the corridor, which is not really a reconceptualization of shipping, but it is an interesting example. That there's the Inuit protected area that is being established in Nunatsiavut with the participation of Makivik, which also offers some sort of interesting new way of thinking in terms of managing and protecting resources. Recently, there was the SINA agreement that is advertised as investing in the Inuit economy and protecting ecosystem. That's an agreement between the Kikiktanuit Inuit Association, the Pew Trust, and the Auyurak Conservation Fund Society. So there's more engagement. And at the international level, you have the Inuit Circumpolar Council, for instance, becoming a member, a consultant of the IMO, which is meaningful, but it's also potentially short-lived. And there is the UN, the BBNJ, so the UN use of agreement on the use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, that interestingly is involving maritime indigenous peoples who actually sort of align with small island states. I think this is an interesting development. So I think there are things happening. I don't know if I would call them reconceptualizing this relationship between us humans and indigenous peoples and the resources of the marine environment. What is not clear is how these initiatives, I'm thinking mostly about Canada now, how they are actually effectively resulting in empowering Inuit communities, including in the improvement of social and economic conditions. And that is something that, I mean, even though there is a lot of effort and there's a lot of investment, I think it's a very important question, how actually effective these new ways of approaching governance issues in the Canadian Arctic are actually having a positive impact on the communities. So yes, that was my answer.
Thank you. Rike?
Yeah, I too found it a bit difficult to answer that question. I'm in a research group that changed its name from Innovative Fisheries Management to Center for Blue Governance, because exactly like following this shift. But I must admit, like when I wanted to do my research in Greenland, it's been a bit difficult to identify these emerging cases that we could compare it with. And also, I should note, I don't have a complete overview. It's just from my perspective what I can tell you. But I think there's been some ongoing innovation and experimentation with seaweed, which is an interesting new product. And then otherwise, I think it's like a lot of these birds on the roof, like the oil and gas industry, that at some point might not come, and also, and then again, the minerals are mostly on land, so maybe that's not so blue again. And I think also the green energy discussions they're having is maybe also more, but it is of course connected to the ice sheet and the meltwater, and so in a way we might call that blue if it takes off. But something that I do think is happening and is interesting is maybe on a more smaller scale. And also if we talk about like local communities, I think in terms of food innovation and gastronomy, for example, there's an interest in like, using new products like local chefs working with chips made from fish skin, or there's a research project going on that looks a lot into the traditional ways of procurement with drying and fermentation, and how these bacteria have a positive effect on the body. And so, but so maybe things are happening like more small scale, which is maybe also more like a fit with what's actually available in Greenland in terms of the tech industries, and so that's not hardly any, I would say. Yeah, it's difficult to say yes or no or something. This is kind of what I could think of. Not a huge rethinking, but maybe a twinking. I don't know. Yeah. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that. Anna?
So if I just take a point of departure in Iceland, I can see that there has been a process of reconceptualization in relation to these enzyme industries, and it has, and the way it changes communities is that all of a sudden fisheries are not the main thing, but some industry that is making new technical solutions, either engaging in the medical industry development, or they're contributing to the cosmetic industry or supplement industry or whatever you have. And we have some particular communities where this is more outspoken, like Ísafjörður, Siglufjörður, if you will, and some others. But then this reconceptualization is not taking place at all in other places, and so I think there are some parallel processes where this is not at all any issue. Another thing that is really changing some of the coastal communities particularly in some region is very rapidly developing aquaculture with often detrimental environmental effects. And so this has spurred loud discussions on to what extent we want to allow foreign direct investment in aquaculture in our fjords. And I think maybe what sums this up is that we have a more multiple range of actors that are interested in using the seascapes. And so therefore, and we're not part of this marine spatial planning effort of Europe, barely have any protected marine areas. We have one major, but that's it. So I think this reconceptualization of how we use the sea and the seascapes around our coast will eventually urge us to make some more better planning, I guess.
Thanks, Anna. And David.
So on March 24th, 1989, I was standing in the counseling area of Westfield High School where my dad was a counselor, and there's a TV. And he was showing me pictures that were coming in from the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Over the last 25 years, as an anthropologist, I've spent my time, quite a bit of time researching the impact of that spill. I've actually worked on many studies about that. I worked in the litigation as a young person, working in a filing room, reading the stories of how that spill impacted people. In Alaska, we had this juxtaposition between extraction of oil and gas and fisheries. And so I think, it's important to understand that I'm a disaster anthropologist, but I'm also a fisheries anthropologist. And which is most of what I've done a lot of my research on for my dissertation and later. And, our fisheries are fully capitalized in Alaska. And, I used to work for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I was a manager there in a small social science division. And I spent my time in front of the Board of Fisheries trying to explain to them the value of fisheries to rural communities in Alaska. And, we had this juxtaposition between these two industries, and which are both important. And I would probably tell you that when I worked for the department, I would say that we had some of the best managed fisheries in the world. We have the largest salmon runs in the world. Our fisheries are abundant. They're well managed. But I think that has changed. And so we are dealing with situations where you have a decline of species like Chinook salmon in the Yukon River. They are coming later. The water is not as cold. I stand in the river of the Kasilof every year and dip net for salmon. And I used to stand out there and it was freezing. And, I had to put on layers, and now I stand out there in a t-shirt with my waders on, and the water is warm. It is just not cold anymore. Salmon need oxygen-rich cold water to spawn in and to rear. And this is changing across Alaska, and we're all very concerned about this. So we have these two, we also have a decline in oil and gas. I think the Exxon Valdez was a wake-up call about how we deal with oil and gas in Alaska. And so I think that has changed, but we're also running out of that resource, and we're trying to think about what is next. Mariculture is probably what is next and in Alaska, and it's being really heavily pushed by a lot of interest in Alaska. The seaweed farming is a big one. We have shellfish farms, but all of those shellfish are just eaten locally. So they're just oysters. They're eaten locally. And so those have expanded, but we also have issues with harmful algal blooms. I just came back from Haines and Cluckwan in the Upper Link Canal, and they can't even grow oysters up there. The toxin levels are just way too high. And so there are places in Alaska where we can't do this. So our governor, in his infinite wisdom, has put before our legislature proposals to do fish farming. And he wants to do these in closed systems because it is illegal to farm salmon in Alaska. But he is pushing this as a new industry for Alaska, closed pen fish farms. I'm not sure what that means, and nobody knows what it means. And the legislature, especially from fishing communities, was not very happy about this, seeing this proposal. So we're kind of at a crossroads. We've been pushing mariculture in our state, growing seaweed. Our program at Alaska Sea Grant has several shellfish and seaweed mariculture specialists. We're trying to develop these industries, but there really is no market for it. And so we're trying to figure out how that could work. And I come back to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Before the oil spill, a fisherman in Cordova could be a fisherman. They could fish for herring, they could fish for salmon, they could feed their family, they could get a new truck every year. They did well. But after the oil spill, the herring went away and all they could fish for was salmon. And now they have to find other jobs. They can't be full-time fishermen. And so how do we actually meet a need within the environment? Mariculture is one of those things. We're testing that in Kodiak. People are being commercial fishermen, and outside of that season, they're also growing seaweed and to supplement their income. And so unless you're a big boat fisherman in Alaska that can Capitalize has a lot of capital that you can move around to all sorts of different fisheries throughout the year. You can't be a full-time fisherman. This is a real problem for our rural communities because a lot of our Alaska Native community fishermen have sold out their permits because they just couldn't make it anymore as full-time fishermen. And so we have this drain of permits across the state. We have a limited entry permit system. And so a lot of communities have lost local permits. Communities that used to have many boats in the harbor now might have one commercial fishing boat. And so this is a drain on our local economies. It also means that that income is not in those communities because every fishing boat is a business. So thanks.
Thanks, Evan. And that's actually a good segue into our next question. Not that it's a good situation, but it's a good to get to our next question. Based on your research and or practice or experiences, what are the main issues and challenges related to the blue economy and maritime activities? And this time we'll start with Rike.
It's really interesting to listen to what you others have to tell from the different regions, I must say, just taking it in. I think in Greenland still is a diversification, which is the main issue, because even though I flagged the high dependence and how important the fishery is, it's also problematic and it's vulnerable, maybe for reasons like Devin is telling, like it can suddenly change. And it's actually been the ambition for many years in Greenland that they like to develop other pillars in their economy, for example, tourism or minerals or now green energy. So in an economic sense, it seems like it's like having some backup, some more industries to build resilience. That's the main challenge. But then I think for my research, it's also really interesting what's happening with climate change and biodiversity change. And there's a lot of uncertainty still, like what's happening and what's going to happen. But we and colleagues, we talk like tipping points, major shifts in the food webs. Are some of these like more Arctic systems being maybe replaced by the more Atlantic systems, new species coming in? And so when we did the interviews and engaged with stakeholders, it seems that if there are new opportunities coming in, they can definitely grab onto them. It can be a new mackerel or it can be cod fishery that starts further north, where before it was mostly mammal hunting. But when there are also stories about, for example, in South Greenland, a cod that's not coming into the fjord systems, maybe not because of glacier melt and changes in how attractive is the coastal systems. When this happens and there's an absence of resources, I think that you can really start to feel like this vulnerability in how the communities, they don't have much else to really do. And then you start seeing a region with a lot of out-migration and empty houses and that kind of stuff. So there are some regional differences where some regions are thinking it's really interesting times and others is a bit status quo and still a hard region. Also maybe because of, we also, in Greenland, they also saw some privatization of fish quota and consolidation back in the days. One thing that's really interesting is also what this glacier melt does to the fjord systems. There's a lot of material coming out now, like sandy, muddy stone. And also there's talk about like some of the very most productive systems in Greenland is what they call like sea ending glaciers, right? With the glacier coming in and doing all this upwelling. So it's a big joke of what will happen if some of these glaciers, they will terminate on land in, let's say, 20 years or something. So these are kind of the issues I see.
Thanks. Anna, we'll turn to you.
Yeah, I think a concern on changes is primarily a combination of fisheries governance implications and the changing ecology of the ocean that is caused by various external and internal factors, I guess. And as it manifests in Iceland, we have always claimed that maybe our fishery management regime is unfair socially, but it's at least very secure in terms of maintaining stocks and maximum sustainable yields and so on. But it turns out that we have a lot of different fishery stocks that have traditionally been harvested that are failing to regenerate, and the capelin is one of them, flounder is one of them. Yeah, there's a lot of species, and then we have, of course, have had some promising new ones coming in, like the tuna and the mackerel into our exclusive zone. Some positive surprises there, but still, I mean, this is a very, very dynamic scene, and the most problematic thing about it is that we simply know too little of these dynamics in the ocean that may be caused by climate or may be caused by overfishing and loss of biodiversity to regulate properly. And I think that's a major concern for future to come.
Thank you. David?
So I have two things. So one of the major issues that we're facing, and it goes back to the, I talked about the oil spill. I forgot to mention that I sit on the scientific advisory committee for the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council, which is a council funded by proceeds from the oil pipeline. It's a council that exists in law after the Exxon Valdez oil spill through the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And we fund a lot of research in the Prince William Sound region on everything from spawning herring and where they're spawning, and I talked about the crash of that fishery, but there's actually going to be an opening this year for the first time since the oil spill for herring. And they have returned, and they've returned in very large numbers. Their biomass is growing exponentially. And so that's a great sign to see, because I actually really love herring. And I've been to one of the herring museums in Iceland, and it's super cool to see that. But I wanted to talk about a little bit about Arctic shipping. And this is another thing that we're very concerned about. I've been working on a series of panels for the National Academy of Science, thinking about, issues with oil spills in Alaska and the outcome of that. And we're going to be hosting a workshop here soon to think about social science research questions on oil spills for the Chugach Regional Resources Commission. But one of the things I'm really concerned about is what happens with all of the shipping that is going by Western Alaska and then over the Arctic. We have no response capability. If a ship goes adrift, we can have real serious issues. And it doesn't matter if that ship is just carrying bulk goods or they're carrying bunker fuel. Both the ship is still filled with all sorts of oil and fluids. And if that ship were to break up or go adrift and hit the shore, we could have a catastrophe, and there's absolutely nobody to respond to it except for the local residents. So this is one thing that we're considering and thinking about, is where the next oil spill will be. So, in terms of Arctic, the opening up of the Arctic and thinking about this, we've also had cruise ships go through. There are more of them. We've only had one large one come through, but there's quite a growing number of smaller cruise ships, under 1,000 passengers. I guess that's small, that are starting to come through. And, these type of practices are just growing in number. This week when I was in Southeast Alaska, during COVID, they actually did some research on the water quality of Southeast Alaska waters. Any given day in the summer in Southeast Alaska and Juneau, you can go down to the harbor and see 5 cruise ships with 5 to 6,000 people each tied up at the dock. And this is a real concern for us, because we these cruise ships are putting pollution into our waters. And this study showed that the waters were much cleaner during the time that there were no ships in the region. And so as this grows throughout both Alaska and the Arctic, and we see more and more of this, they're also disrupting hunting activities that are happening in Western Alaska. People being out on the land, and all of a sudden a bunch of tourists show up. And so these practices are things that are real challenges when we think about maritime activity.
Thank you for that. And Claudio.
I think that most of the points I wanted to make were already made, mostly connected to shipping. But so maybe just to add to what Devin was saying, I think that what's happening is that basically the opening of the Arctic becoming more accessible, of course, and it's about dealing with new activities and new actors. And there is a clear change in geopolitical situation right now that it's extremely complex to a point that I think even maybe the Arctic Council is confused about what's happening. It's hard to know. It is hard to know what's happening and what's going to happen. But in terms of shipping, yes, I mean, besides oil spills, there's the capacity to respond. There is the underwater noise that is also creating disturbances. It's the push to from some shipping companies connected to mining to make the shipping seasons longer, potentially disrupting migration patterns and habitats of marine mammals. There is the capacity, as Devin was saying, to respond in terms of search and rescue operations. Ultimately, it's the vulnerability of Inuit communities. So in terms of beyond shipping, I think there's also the need to develop proper engagement mechanisms to maybe in the line with co-governance, with the involvement of indigenous organizations and local communities. But there is a clear also sort of engaging fatigue that at least in the Canadian Arctic, there's all the communities are very small, and there's consultations all the time, and the requests to participate come from researchers, and they come from the government, and they come from different departments in the government, and so on. So it's a little bit of the lack of local capacity to respond to a lot of these, initiatives that might be well-intentioned in terms of engaging people, but this comes also in line with another problem, which is sort of the fragmentation of governance and management in the Canadian Arctic, at least, where you sort of tackle one problem at a time instead of having a more integrated, holistic approach, maybe with a proper marine spatial plan. But anyway, I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you for that. And that brings us to our final question. What are the implications of the issues and challenges that you've identified in relation to Indigenous and local coastal communities' knowledge and knowledge mobilization in the Arctic region? And for this question, we'll start with Anna.
Yes, I want to say that I see a very different ontological approach or cosmology emerge in the Western understanding of rationality that influences decision-making on, let's say, resource governance or fishery management regimes, and the Inuit cosmology. And but I also think personally, I'm very fascinated of the Inuit cosmology of the sea, because it does not necessarily make this very clear distinction between land and sea, as Claudius mentioned, and we learned on our Amundsen Sandeland North research trip this last autumn as well. So I mean, I simply this more holistic approach to the sea, and then combined with more hopeful, I think transdisciplinary understanding that I gained on our trip, where I understand much better now that the macro processes and the micro processes are much more interconnected than we ever can imagine, is something that I personally learned and I appreciate. But I think also, as I think Claudio mentioned, the Inuits are rather vulnerable when it comes to all these geopolitical processes. And I've seen it in my own home country emerge, where you see a coastal community without access to the surrounding sea, without the license to fish. And that's a pretty vulnerable situation. I think it is very needed that we get the indigenous perspective more prominent in governance of the seas.
Thanks, Anna. David?
I want to follow up on something Anna said about our trip on the Amundsen. So we were supposed to go up and do this river sampling. So most of the sampling was done from the ship. And of course, being from Alaska, they sent Jake, who was also here, and I, because we have boat experience, up on a landing craft, or what they call a barge, and a couple of other students. And we started up the river, and the skies were dark, and the waves got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we were getting pretty beat up. And so eventually we had to turn around. There was just no way we were going to get up that river. And of course the steering went out, and then they had to have somebody come get us. But it was a good time, actually. So one of the things I kept questioning was, why didn't we just work with somebody locally to do this sampling? And there is so much knowledge about these river systems. They could tell us where to go. They could tell us how to get up that river properly. They could provide the equipment, and they have the knowledge. They also might have areas that they're really interested in doing sampling. So you can have these collaborations between these communities and the scientists to do research that is actually really relevant locally and also societally relevant. So I guess one of the last things I want to say is that I'm really excited that Jake, who's also here, and I are going to host a workshop called Our Way of Life in Sitka here in a few weeks. And we're bringing together the Kodiak Area Native Association, the Native Village of Eyak, and the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, along with the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, with fishing interest groups like the Alaska Landlocked Fishermen's Association and others. And so what we've done is we paired a regional tribe with the fishing organization that represents the fishermen in that area, because both are doing these climate resilience plans. And why are we doing these in silos when we could be working together to think about issues that affect everyone's way of life? And so I think I have this real hope that we can kind of break down these barriers and build these collaborations. And it's not really about different knowledge systems. I mean, everybody makes observations. It's really about bringing people together to think about how they can work together to do science, because we all do science. The scientific process is the same whether you're an indigenous person out on the landscape, testing your theories, taking data, getting information, or if you're a scientist working in a lab. And so I think we can really work together to think about this. And I want to just leave with that, because I think it's a really hopeful thing for the future, to think about how we can work together to build more resilient communities for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren.
Thank you. Claudio?
There is no doubt that we can work together. I think that one of the issues is, I do think that the knowledge systems are different, in a sense that there is a different way of doing science than understanding, let's say, the ecosystem or the marine environment or everything that from the perspective of a local community. I think I've been thinking about this issue quite a while. I think the problem is when you have, let's say, a management plan or a governance approach or something, or a marine protected area or whatever that requires data from different sources. You need something that is called decision support system. So you have like decision support tools that will aid into the decision-making process to make a decision about, let's say, a speed reduction zone for a ship, for instance, but it could be many other things. The problem is that the tools that we have for that type of approach are usually aligned with data in a more traditional way that can be, so it's easier to visualize, for instance, ecological data that has been scientifically collected or produced for a marine spatial plan than to use the local data. And what I think it's needed is to develop mechanisms to know how to deal with local knowledge. Because in essence, it's okay, we can have consultations, we can collaborate in research, collecting data programs, but it also comes to the point where you start wondering, okay, so all this understanding, all this knowledge, all this wisdom needs to be somewhat processed. It needs to be shared in some form to support the decision making. Maybe I'm a little bit confusing myself here, but I think that there is something to be said also about how do we document this local knowledge? How do we curate that knowledge? How do we share that knowledge? Because there are issues around, of course, data sharing and knowledge sharing from the community sides. But the problem is that this type of issues such as shipping or marine protected areas, etc., they do require the input from the local communities. And I think I'm not negative, I'm just saying there is something to be explored in terms of how do we actually work with different types of knowledge, including local observations. Anyway, sorry, I wasn't very clear, but I'm still thinking about these issues.
No worries. Maybe we can also come back to it in the discussion if it comes up again. And Rike.
Well, maybe I can follow up to Claudio. Claudio, I think I follow what you mean. I also remember like preparing a proposal around these ideas, but I also remember meeting some skepticism from different research environments, and I think there's some really interesting developments also going on in terms of research ethics and ICC guidelines on how to work with local indigenous knowledge and ownership and impact. And that's something that, like, for example, can you even do this? And do you sometimes take local knowledge away from its original context and should it, and all these? So I think there's some really interesting and things to think about it in terms of how do we go about being ethical when we do local ecological knowledge research. And there was a workshop last week with Arctic Hub, which is an organization in Greenland that gathers researchers from abroad, and we discussed exactly ethics. And something they suggested was to really also hire locally when we do these research, and it's even kind of a local middleman in a way that sits various projects and can act as translator and also data collector. And that was actually also something we did on our recent project. We tried to do different interviews in different communities, but the one where I think we got the most interesting data was where there was a local team of two young people. He was a fisherman who had grown up in the community, but also working with the municipality. And she was a social science researcher who is now who's been living there for a while. And together they just had a very nice skill set in terms of she could really also help, like how do you go about doing a good interview guide, and he had also really excellent trust and all that. So there are so many different ways in how can we do this in the future. And I'm also thinking maybe it's not me as much as I like it. I really like talking to fishermen and getting these stories. Maybe it's not me who should do this in the future, but I definitely still like to be part of it. And the important thing is, I really think that the local ecological knowledge has things to offer. And I think it's interesting how when at least in these interviews, when a fisher explains a change, he immediately starts theorizing how it connects to changes in the food web or a predator that's affecting it. So I think it just goes so well to these ecosystem the dynamics that the scientists are also studying. And I also think the next step is really it's curious. I think it's curious for scientists I think they're curious about reading what the fishermen say, and in a way it gets digested that way. But I still think we also need to see these products or assessments or even biological advice for what to do that truly integrates these two aspects. Maybe it's more informal so far. So interesting and developing field, I would say, but also challenging.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for their great discussion around these questions. So what we're going to do now is open up the discussion to the audience members. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can raise your hand. I think it's in the React button with the heart. I can never find it half the time, but I think it's there, so we can try that. Or if you have a question as well, you can put it in the chat and we'll grab it there. So are there any questions to start with? Okay, so if there's no question, I will go first and with a question. So it's been really interesting to see with the different scales. So we're looking at different governance at different levels, different communities. And so I was wondering, when we think about local and versus international, and we think about governance and a lot of these concerns, I'm wondering if what differences do we see? Is there a difference in effectiveness between, say, international, national, or local governance, and what works better? Is it a combination? And how can we, I guess, improve governance to make sure things are equitable? Because as Claudia mentioned, there's that blue equity concept, which I thought was really interesting as well.
I think it depends on the issue for sure. So there are some issues that are probably just local, and some that are just national, and then you have shipping, which is sort of all of the above, including international. I think that at least in terms of the efforts to engage local communities, I mean, I find Canada is quite unique, to be honest, in terms. But I don't know so much about the approaches in Greenland and Alaska and Iceland. But when you look at sort of the co-governance frameworks, when you look at again the sort of the Inuit protected areas, and there are a few really interesting cases of Indigenous engagement in British Columbia. There seems to be also glimmers of hope there, because there are some very interesting successes, I think, in terms of the governance of local areas. But yeah, that's my take. I don't know.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panel? Yep, David.
This is a really interesting question, because in Alaska we have the local level, we have the state, and then we have the federal government. At the federal government level, their goals, at least at the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, is maximum harvest to feed the nation. And that's why we have some of the largest seafood ports in the United States are in Alaska. At the state level, it's maximum participation. The allowance to have the maximum number of Alaskans be able to participate in different activities, regardless of the stocks. And we also have they ensure that our stocks are sustainable. When I worked at the Department of Fish and Game, the criminal code of Alaska was about this thick. The Alaska fisheries and game regulations were about that thick. So And I say that because every place in Alaska is unique. And so every place in Alaska has its own regulation system. At the local level, the goal is to ensure that there is adequate food security and that families are fed. But it's also done through a process of the right conduct of how to deal with fish and game resources, because they are not just for food, they are your kin. They're animals that have given themselves to you so that you can feed your family, and you have to treat them properly. So you have these like three different ways of looking at the world. And I think there is, this real conservation ethos that is also often discussed about indigenous peoples. It's not the conservation, it's just the right conduct of working with animals and fish that have provided themselves to you, and you have to treat them properly and with respect. So there's all of these different ways of looking at the world, and I think this creates an interesting dynamic for discussion. And so that's a great question, Karen.
Any other responses? Any other questions? So I actually have another question.
There's a question. There's a question in the audience.
Oh, is there?
One is raising his hand, but we cannot hear him.
It's me. It's from
Yes.
Iceland.
Great.
Anna Karlsdóttir the friends. I was very inspired by. I've learned a lot, and thank you, Damon, for not describing indigenous and Western knowledge systems as worlds apart, especially when you're thinking about you as an ecological anthropologist like me, is pretty compatible with the holistic indigenous view. It's often what I try to teach my students. And then I wanted to show you this thing which Anna talked about. This is made from cod enzymes in Iceland, and is now the hottest thing in Iceland for preventing cold from developing. The skin developed for putting on feet, legs, has saved my father's leg. So there's a lot of, you were mentioning these personal issues, but what I wanted to just be allowed to mention was to follow up on what Rika was saying and others about different interests, and that this is a forest of interest, knowledge systems in Greenland. And I've been studying the various economic sectors in Greenland, and not just the different ecological, the indigenous knowledge, but interests, and it's so polarized. It's so polarized, and the waste projects invites us to think about these conflicts of interest and stratification. And if you go, as I've been doing now, like 3 times to South Greenland, you go and you hear the people telling you, it's not just they have knowledge, they have solutions, what should be done better, differently, interests, serving their interests. In Narsaq, Royal Greenland gets fish from small-scale fishermen, and they take the heads and intestines away, and they throw it away instead of making fish meal, and the farmers complain about that. They would like the fish meal, so they wouldn't have to buy all this barley from Europe. And then the fish is frozen and sent to China. In Nanortalik, on the other hand, there are 46 people, not in a factory, not producing intermediate product, but final product, bacalao, sent to Portugal and Spain. And then you go there and you talk to individuals, and they curse the 5 EU trawlers who are there taking cod out away from people in Koktok and Narsaq and Nanortalik, and they say the money they are getting for selling the quota doesn't go to benefit society at large. It goes to the ivory tower in Nuuk, and it's their way of, so it's the stratification between Nuuk. They get the money. It doesn't go to Guyalek municipality or these towns. Instead, if you close this factory, families, perhaps 47 families, there are 1,100 people in Nanortalik, plus the families of those 15 who work on the trawler, which actually makes fish meal also, which can be sold by a lower price to the farmers. So they have a lot of solutions. And so the battleground in Greenland is very much about processing of fish, how to do it, where is it done, who is doing the work. And when you go to Disco Bay, I talked to the fishermen who are quite affluent. They say, "Oh, yes, of course, the Danish company is bringing in Asian labor force to process the fish. That's because they're not offering the young people who are unemployed enough money for processing the fish." So what they're trying to do, Royal Greenland now, actually by hiring Icelanders, is to technologically make the equipment more complicated so that there'll be fewer jobs, but higher paid, and the locals will get them. So there's a lot happening in Greenland. And and the political economy is very complicated, but the battle for me, in my view, is about being able to make value added locally and that it benefits people there. What do you think, Rikke?
I agree. From my main, when having to discuss like recommendations for adaptation and following what fishers they suggested, it was always about like adding one more factory to increase competition and fish prices in their community, or establishing a fish factory and breaking this monopoly that they feel like that's also present when there's only one company. So I agree, like what you say about solutions. They have to, and from what you call maybe a political landscape with certain competing interests, they often address the solutions often address some equity or some concerns of how the value are distributed into society.
I look forward to talking to Rikke later more about this. I'll work together in Greenland.
Are there any other questions or comments? If there's no further questions or comments, I would like to thank our panelists for taking the time to speak with us today about their research and their background. And I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I know I've learned a lot more about the blue economy than I knew coming into this roundtable today. So thank you very much. And before we end the session, I'm just going to take this opportunity to shamelessly plug our next roundtable series, which will be held on May 22nd. On the topic of young polar researchers, perspectives, challenges, and insights, which is organized by some of the WAGE students, some of whom are here today. If anybody wanted to say something, feel free, but no pressure. Otherwise, thank you very much. Thank you for joining the WAGE Roundtable today, and we look forward. Oh, Aisha, you came online. Do you want to say something?
I wasn't intending to, but I can.
Okay.
So we're working hard on the next WAGE session, and I hope we can see you there. We're very excited to share with you our insights and challenges as young scholars we're experiencing.
And if there's nothing else, thank you again for coming today. It was great seeing everyone, and we hope we'll see you next time.